Hello and welcome. In this tutorial, we're going to guide you through the exciting process of setting up a Splunk environment on VirtualBox using CentOS 7. Our ultimate aim by the end of this tutorial is to grant you the ability to access Splunk Enterprise from outside the virtual machine. Firstly, we'll need to prepare our environment by downloading and installing some essential tools. Follow along with me on screen as we download and install VirtualBox for Windows, Angry IP Scanner, MobaXterm or any SSH client tool of your choice, CentOS 7 ISO installer, and the Splunk Enterprise. Let's go ahead and download the VirtualBox installer for Windows. Follow me on screen to download and install VirtualBox. Next, let's download and install Angry IP Scanner. This tool helps us scan the available IPs on our network. We will use this later in the tutorials. Now, I will download and install MobaXterm to use for SSH access to the remote server. Alternatively, you can use any SSH client tool, such as PuTTY. Next, download the Linux ISO installer that we will be using in this tutorial. I'm using CentOS 7 here. Next, download the Splunk Enterprise installer that we will be using later. To simplify the process later on, click Command line with and copy the content and saved it. Now that we have downloaded and installed the tools needed to build and install the Splunk environment on VirtualBox, let's get started. Follow me on the screen to create a virtual machine. I've used the default configuration for the specifications here, but feel free to adjust them based on the requirements for your Splunk environment. Now that we've created the virtual machine instance, let's go ahead and start it. During the CentOS 7 installation process, I'll stick with the default settings and opt for automatic partitioning for my storage. Feel free to make adjustments as needed. Remember to set up the root password. After completing all the settings and configurations, please click on Reboot. After rebooting the server, log in as the root user. To check if our instance has an IP address attached, use the IP command. Now, let's use the intui command to set up the IP address and hostname for this server. Here, we need to set up a manual, static IP address. To find the default gateway IP, execute the ipconfig command on your laptop's command line. Now, open Angry IP Scanner to check the available IPs. And choose the one you want to use. After the scan has completed, choose the IP you want to use. IP addresses with a red circle indicate availability. Here, I've selected an AM using the IP address 10.0.0.65. Don't forget to set the DNS server to 8.8.8.8 to ensure instance has internet access. Now, let's set up the hostname for the instance. After setting up the IP address and hostname, let's reboot the server. Log in again as root to verify that the IP address and hostname have been set up correctly. Now, let's use MobaXterm to SSH to the virtual machine we have created, and we can start the Splunk installation. The first thing we need to do is install the WIP package. Now, let's create a user for Splunk and create the Splunk directory. Change the permissions of the Splunk directory to be owned by the user Splunk and the group Splunk. Switch the user from root to Splunk. Then, let's download the Splunk Enterprise installer. Now that we have downloaded the installer, let's enter the package using the command on the screen. Next, navigate to the Splunk bin directory, start Splunk, and accept the license. Then, set up the username and password for Splunk Web. Switch the user from Splunk to root. Then let's enable Splunk to start on boot. Now, attempt to access Splunk Web using a web browser on your laptop outside of this VirtualBox. Note that we won't be able to access it at this point, because we need to update the internal firewall configuration of our virtual machine instance. Let's update the firewall configuration to allow traffic on port 8000 using TCP, enabling us to access the Splunk Web outside of the virtual machine instance. After updating the firewall, you should now be able to access the Splunk Web, log in using the credentials we created earlier. Thank you for completing this tutorial on building and setting up a Linux environment using Oracle VirtualBox and installing Splunk Enterprise for your development needs. I trust that you've successfully followed the steps and gained valuable insights from this guide. Happy learning!